Chip Chapman is a retired British Army Major General. Welcome to our program, General Chapman.
Good afternoon, Daniel. It's good to be back.
US President Donald Trump says that Vladimir Putin is going to agree with 30-day ceasefire proposal. Is he right?
I don't think he's right at the moment. I think, like all these things with Putin, he sees the notion of a ceasefire as a precondition being placed upon him by the West. So I don't think he will go for that. He will only go for that in two circumstances, which I think your head of your intelligence said this year. The first one is if he needs a pause to, because the military are running out of operational tempo, or their armament parks are emptied, or secondly, because the economy is in such a state this year that they need a pause. And it's both of those, I think, which are the case in terms of a pause rather than the notion from Russia of a permanent peace. Because again, I think it's this notion of long-term security for both countries, even though from a Russian perspective it might be skewed, which is the key to a durable and sustainable peace. From a Ukrainian perspective, of course, that is for some sort of security guarantees, so that pause, as described by your intelligence chief, doesn't turn into another attempt for land grab and to destroy the sovereignty of Ukraine. From a Russian perspective, it's difficult to know, apart from the grand strategic interest of the Russians is still, in my opinion, to regain lost territory and spheres of influence, to roll things back to the sort of 1997 era in terms of the Central Europe and Eastern Europe being under the vassalship of Russia.
Don't you think that Vladimir Putin now faces a difficult position? Because if he rejects this offer on 30-day ceasefire, then Donald Trump could impose sanctions against his regime. If he accepts this offer, then he could face pressure domestically by his, for example, hardliner colleagues.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. What we saw earlier in the year is the notion of a pressure strategy being applied, but it was being applied particularly by the Americans on Ukraine in terms of the cessation of intelligence and large-scale weapon flows. And that seemed to be pretty asymmetrical, where they were rewarding the aggressor. That is, there was no pressure strategy being placed upon Russia. So if Putin does walk away from his own meeting, because it was his idea to have the meeting in Istanbul on the 15th, then that pressure strategy reverses from that previous position of that which was applied to Ukraine, and potentially applies to Russia in three ways. Firstly, the arms flows will increase both from the Western allies and the US, I suspect. The second one is that certainly from a European perspective and an American perspective, I think there will be the 17th sanctions package. And thirdly, I think the interesting sidebar potentially is the fact that Trump is in KSA, Saudi Arabia at the moment, and one of his other notions was that if you got a barrel of oil down to $45 a barrel, that would implode the Russian economy, given the fact that the description by John McCain of Russia is a country, a gas station with oil, with nukes masquerading as a country. So if you can collapse that part of the economy, then they might have to come to the table. So in terms of game theory and the payoff matrix, as at today, things would not look to be in favor of Russia.
Can you imagine a scenario in which Vladimir Putin meets President Zelensky personally?
I can, but I don't think that I could see that this week, and certainly not in Istanbul on Thursday. And I think the dilemma in the way that both countries are looking at this at the moment. So they're looking at it from other opposite ends of a spectrum, really. Ukraine and the West, really, are looking at this from a position of a start state. That is, that it is a ceasefire for 30 days, which has been on the table since the 11th of March, which kicks off the process of negotiations, Istanbul or somewhere else. Russia seems to look at it in terms of the end state must be looked at first to take account of the two things that it keeps on talking about, the territorial realities, which means that they won't give up the bits of Ukraine that they've illegally annexed, and also in terms of what they keep calling their long-term interests and root causes. Now, again, from their perspective, the root causes may be farcical, but fit their sort of world mindset in terms of everything is the fault of the West, and Ukraine are an enabler for that, and therefore Ukraine should either be a vassal state under the jackboot of Russia or cease to exist. That is, in my view, the ultimate grand strategic objective of Putin. That hasn't changed. That is his maximalist position from my perspective.
Also, it was interesting to observe that Putin did this big press conference at night, right after this big coalition of the willing meeting in the Ukrainian capital of Kyiv, right after the European ultimatum to begin the 30-day ceasefire. Don't you think that Putin also is trying to find a way out for him and for his regime, but on appropriate for Russia terms?
Of course, it's for appropriate for Russia terms, and for that reason, you have to look at why wars finish and why wars don't finish. So wars finish for one, two, or three reasons: either because of decisive military victory. That is not likely to happen at the moment for either side. Secondly, because of the improbability of military victory, that is, that itself gives you a condition where you come to the negotiating table. Or thirdly, because the cost, either in terms of demographics to a country or its economy or infrastructure, are so great that you're forced to the table. But also from Putin's perspective, particularly because he's been in power for 25 years, I think you have to look at the reasons that wars don't stop. And the first one is leaders' fear of the loss of a power base. Now, President Zelensky has said he would willingly give up power if it would lead to a just and durable peace. You won't hear that sort of language from Putin. And indeed, it's the need for Putin for a sufficient victory to justify the cost and sacrifice that he's already incurred, which keeps him going. And it's that which has got him on the horns of a dilemma. So it is either that the Russian military either defects and walks off the battlefield, as it did in 1917, which led to the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. I don't think we're going to see that at the moment. Or secondly, that the economy implodes, even though there are sort of indicators that things are all looking sort of increasingly red in metric terms. We can often overplay that. I mean, I remember in 2011-12, the same things being said about the the Syrian economy, and they managed to keep going for another 12 years. And I'm always minded that Prigozhin said that Russia might have to live like North Korea for a few years. And if you've hacked the minds of the people of Russia, as they have for most of them, then it might be that they could actually do that. The third reason that it might end is because of elite defections of those around Putin. But again, I don't think that we see any indication of that at the moment. And indeed, the Putanistas are really quite strong around him, and you don't see those elite defections happening. And that is the dilemma which he faces. He has to, in a way, at the moment, keep going to reward what's happened. He did mention for the first time that it's a war, not a special military operation. But it's difficult in political terms for Putin to see how a successful and off-ramp would be unless he can assure Russia that he's taken all those illegally annexed provinces as a minimum. And of course, that was signed into legislation in the Duma. And the fact that he doesn't own any of them, and again, that was one of the problems with Witkoff's ideas for peace, because of course, 42% of Kherson is still in Ukrainian hands. 40% of Donetsk is still in Ukrainian hands. 30% of Zaporizhia is still in Ukrainian hands. So the notion that you would just give away all those oblasts to the Russians is, of course, farcical.
Does it mean that Putin is afraid of the possibility of losing his grip on power in case of ceasefire with Ukraine on appropriate for Ukraine terms, on normal terms?
Yeah, I think there is a chance of that, not for a ceasefire on 30 days, but for what would come after that. Now, I think it's clear from all the things that President Trump has said that his intent is absolutely to end the war, and the main effort in President Trump's eyes is a ceasefire and then negotiations. And I don't think that Trump sees it through a prism of winning and losing. He does think of it in terms of stopping the killing. Now, in many ways, you could say that would be looking at war as or peace through a humanitarian prism. The problem with that, of course, is it rewards the aggressor. What the West would say, and Ukraine, and of course, which I would support, is that there should be a just peace, as Guterres has said, of the UN, in accordance with international law, the UN Charter, and with UN General Assembly instructions. But there's a big delta between those two and what Russia still wants, which is really the equivalent of what happened in the negotiations in Istanbul in 2022, which is that Russia really wants a surrender peace of Ukraine. That is not going to happen. And it's that, not gap analysis, but chasm analysis between the two sides is still so huge that leads you to think that there's very little likelihood in the next few weeks of certainly having a enduring peace settlement, a ceasefire leading to something which would endure. And the reason I say that is also partly from the historical record. So, for example, it took 2 years and 500 negotiations for the Korean War to come to an armistice. It took 5 years of negotiations for the Treaty of Paris to end the Vietnam War. And, negotiations can't be necessarily ticked in a box in a number of weeks, which is obviously President Trump is always in a hurry, but that's not necessarily how diplomacy and negotiations work on these very, very complex issues of conflict termination.
It also seems like Vladimir Putin now is trying to buy more time for his army to even capture more Ukrainian land while he is participating in so-called negotiations with Ukraine and the United States. But for how long Vladimir Putin can wage this war against Ukraine from your perspective? Because he also faces shortages in human power, ammunition, and economies. In Russia's economy is in a free fall right now.
Well, I don't think the economy is quite in free fall. There are many pressure points within that. And of course, we've seen that there are two things which give him a survival strategy within that. The first, of course, is that 80% of Chinese goods that come in are dual use. And the second one is that China would covertly support the North Koreans doing what they're doing, the ammunition, because that allows them to play the sort of neutrality card. I don't think that China wants to see Russia lose, but it would like to see some sort of peace. And increasingly, from what I've just said, Russia is becoming potentially a vassal state of China. Can they keep going? Putin believes that he is winning. Now, it's that old proverb that I've used a number of times, that the chicken pecks grain by grain. And certainly from when President Trump turned off the taps in February and a bit of March, it was the case that advancing armies rarely stop fighting when they perceive that their opponents are weaker. Now, the cost of each kilometer that they take is increasingly severe, but I don't think Putin looks at it through the prism of human life and how many are lost. He looks at it in terms of achieving his political objectives. That is what war is fought for. It is not fought in the end for, we'll stop when you lose 1 million casualties or 2 million. It's fought for political objectives. He hasn't achieved all his political objectives, and that's why Peskov, for example, has always said that military operations will continue until all objectives are secured. And Lavrov, for example, would say that a ceasefire is a road to nowhere. So they are still hard over on using military power to try and achieve their political objectives. No. Can they achieve it? I don't really think so at the moment, as long as the West remains in a position where they are unified. And one of the things I think which came out at the weekend, it was absolutely a position of unity between the Western powers, European Western powers, and the US, which has led to this position that, come to a 30-day ceasefire, or we're going to ramp up the sanctions, weapon flows, and all those things. So we are getting near a kind of point of denouement when it's absolutely clear, as it always should be, to be honest, who the real bad guys are. That's Russia. They did invade Ukraine, and that's obviously against the UN Charter. You can only invade a country if it's established under a UN Security Council resolution or in self-defense under Article 51. Neither of those two applied. It's upset the framework of the Helsinki Final Agreement in 1975, which established the OSCE. And of course, it's against the Budapest Memorandum, which where Ukraine gave away its nuclear weapons in 1994. So on every metric that you look about who's the aggressor and who's in the wrong, it's Russia from my perspective.
And don't you think that Russia's current military objectives are unrealistic because there is a big obstacle on their way? They cannot really cross the Dnieper River to capture the city of Kherson or the city of Zaporizhia. Don't you think that, firstly, they have unrealistic objectives, and why didn't they understand that their aims are unrealistic right now, unachievable?
Because you haven't put a time frame on that, and that's what the Russians aren't doing. So, as Tolstoy sort of said, the two greatest warriors are time and patience. You're looking at it through the current prism there of a week, a month, a year. I don't think Putin and those who are around him are looking at it in that time frame. They're looking at the re-establishment of the Russian Empire and the Russian civilization as they see it in terms of decades and centuries. So you're right that there's a mismatch at the moment between ends, ways and means in military and political terms, but that may not always be the case for the future. So don't look at it through a short-term prism of what's happening today or next month or this year. I think the Russians take a wider spectrum than that, Daniel.
And what are the chances for another Prigozhin-style march on Moscow or any kind of rebellion? Because recently there are developments that indicate the Russian General Surovikin, who was in charge of Russian army in Ukraine and who was related to Prigozhin march on Moscow, has been sent to Africa to work with the Russian embassy.
Yeah, I think that plays into what I said in one of my earlier answers, that it is possible that there is the defection of the Russian army. One of the ways to read Surovikin is, of course, that he's been sort of exiled to ensure that that can't happen. What Russia do still need is the resources that they are hoovering up from their interventions in places like Sudan or Burkina Faso. So it is always the case that the Russian army, where there could be defections of units which then go to regiments, which we've heard some about, then to divisions and above. That would be dangerous, but the organization which surround Putin is fairly robust at the moment. But what looks like a robust regime can also at the same time be a fragile regime. I think that was what the head of MI6 said when he had a meeting with Bill Burns, the former CIA commander, last year. So just because it looks a stable regime at the moment doesn't mean that it's not a fragile regime down the line.
We just discussed with you Russia's unrealistic war aims. However, according to CNN, Russian dictator Vladimir Putin is changing his focus on solidifying his hold on the occupied territories, and he is changing his focus from these goals to also saving Russia's economy in the nearest future. According to the intelligence sources which spoke on the condition of anonymity with CNN journalists, what is your take on such change in Russia's military objectives. At least they try to aim and to achieve their short-term goals in solidifying hold on occupied territories.
Well, I think that plays into what we said earlier on, that if you separate the maximalist objective of destroying the sovereignty of Ukraine and all that nonsense about denazifying it and all that, if you can't achieve that because of the mismatch at this current time between your ends, ways and means, then you have to go back to your minimalist objectives. And the minimalist objective would absolutely be that Crimea and the 4+1, as it were, Crimea and Zaporizhia, Kherson, Donetsk and Luhansk must remain Russian. That will probably be his minimum negotiating position, but with the add-on things which won't be acceptable to do with the size of the size of the Ukrainian army, the fact that it should be neutral, all those things which then give it the potential in the future, if Ukraine doesn't have a security guarantee, to break that and then gobble up the rest of Russia in time, not necessarily next year or in 5 years, but in time.
For how long Vladimir Putin can sustain this pressure from Donald Trump and European allies? And what is your take of the possibility of a ceasefire deal until the end of this year, at least?
I think he can sustain it for quite a while because he's just that sort of guy, really. I don't think. The other thing which is important is, of course, that Trump is very mercurial. Trump doesn't act in a linear strategic fashion. And, he is ultimately the flexible guy. We've seen it in the way that he's approached the tariffs. So today he might seem to be on Ukraine's side. 2 months ago he wasn't. He hasn't got any principles or principles in terms of international relations in his bones. So things can flip quite quickly. You don't know where Witkoff is coming from. The only guy who really has had the sort of the same view throughout really seems to me to be General Kellogg. And if you go back to about 6 months, the position of General Kellogg was he was absolutely clear who the aggressor is, and the line should be come to the table Ukraine or we'll stop supporting you, and at the same time come to the table Russia or we'll give all the support to Ukraine. Now, of course, about a month ago, we weren't sure if they'd cut the table and put the Russian side, put the American side next to the Russian side. So, a mercurial leader who can swivel his opinions on a dime is always someone it's difficult to predict. And that's why at the moment we would say that things are looking good in terms of the support, not only from the coalition of the willing, which I think will remain strong from a Western European perspective, because it is absolutely in Western Europe's interest, vital interest for Ukraine to prevail, particularly because of that notion of the grand strategic interest of Russia being to regain lost territory and spheres of influence. That would be dangerous for the rest of Western Europe. That is not necessarily the same view of the USA. We'll have to wait and see.
You just mentioned about the UK and France-led coalition of the willing. Do you see this as a realistic scenario, as a realistic end game for the war in Ukraine? Coalition of the willing deploying troops to Ukraine to enforce a ceasefire deal. Is it a realistic scenario from your perspective?
Well, I think every scenario is still realistic until it's not, and you shouldn't take any scenario off the table. What I would say about that is that it should not be for Russia to be able to put a veto on that as an option. It's worth saying, of course, that Russia itself has peacekeeping forces in Transnistria and Ossetia so that they prevent Moldova and other parts of former Soviet Union from moving as they would like to the west. So I think they should remain as scenarios, including, of course, the no-fly sort of package there. That might come up in negotiations about where that might be. and the capabilities that it would potentially have, but don't take it off the table at the moment. So it would be credible if it is there to help an enduring and sustainable peace. So it is not. So it is there as a credible thing at the moment. It's credible as a conceptual thing, and it is not for Russia to veto that. That all that sort of stuff would come at negotiations.
Also, according to The Telegraph, there is a big shift in discussions about the possibility of deploying troops to Ukraine. European leaders and military planners are now focusing more on possibility of imposing a no-fly zone over Ukraine, but not on ground deployment, because there is a big lack of troops in the United Kingdom and other European countries. What is your take on that?
Well, I think that can be an option. It's worked previously. We had a no-fly zone, for example, after the first Gulf War, which worked very well. It would impose potentially costs on Russia were they to come across the border in terms of sustaining a durable peace. But again, all the stuff to do with what would be the rules of engagement, whether that would be a trigger point to an Article 5 if they were shot out of the skies, for example. That's why these discussions are complex and potentially would take a long time.
Thank you, General Chapman, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Thank you, Daniel. Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава. Thank you.